I previously reviewed a 540Hz Full HD ETN monitor and I was genuinely impressed. However, it cost a whopping £1,000 in the UK, at least at the time of filming. Now we are looking at the AOC Agon Pro AG246FK, which sports the same refresh rate and resolution and a regular TN panel, but comes in at £600. That is still very expensive for a 24.1-inch Full HD monitor, but nonetheless, I was genuinely curious to see how this would compare to its main competitor and also some of the alternatives out there in the market. Now to kick things off, I thought I should point out that this monitor will require you to have a ridiculous PC setup. Indeed, you're going to need a class-leading CPU and GPU in order for you to output 500 FPS consistently at Full HD. Furthermore, you're going to be wanting to run Windows 11 with the latest Creators build. The reason I say this is because if you do want the access of 540Hz, it's not going to be available to you, for example, if you're running Windows 10 like I am. Indeed, in this respect, it means that I'm capped at 500Hz. Speaking of which, over here, when it comes to the inputs, you have got two HDMI 2.0 ports, but they'll cap you at 240Hz at Full HD. If you do want to access 500Hz, or indeed 540Hz, you'll have to be connected over the singular DisplayPort inputs. Now with that in mind, I went ahead and did my test. The monitor was connected over DisplayPort to a Windows 10 machine, which has a i9-9900K and an RTX 3080. Now first off, when it comes to the overall input lag, the monitor clocked in at just 0.4 milliseconds. And indeed, you'll be able to see over here how it compares to some of its key competitors. What I'll say over here subjectively is the monitor does a phenomenal job when it comes to the overall input lag, and therefore you'll not really notice any sort of delay between your mouse clicks and what is appearing on your screen. It is worth pointing out over here that the monitor does not have any NVIDIA Reflex Analyzer tool, which doesn't really bother me in the slightest. And furthermore, this figure was attained with the low input lag mode enabled via the monitor's OSD. I'm not really sure why you'd ever want to disable it. On a side note, it does become grayed out if you enable adaptive sync technologies and or HDR. So just something worth considering over here, but I didn't really notice an increase in terms of the overall input delay. Now, while its input lag is very impressive, what about when it comes to its response time? Well, unfortunately, this is where things go completely pear-shaped. Now, first off, I should point out that there are a few different overdrive modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. Off, weak, medium, and strong. There's also a boost mode if you were not to enable adaptive sync technologies, and this effectively uses motion blur reduction technologies at its maximum level and also the overdrive set to strong. I'll be touching upon this very shortly. Now with the overdrive set to off using the OSRDD tool, you can see that the average initial time at the bottom left hand side of your screen, which translates to the average G2G, which most manufacturers claim, sits at 3.72. Now what's very worrying over here is the percent in window sitting at just 13%, therefore meaning that the refresh rate window at 500Hz, which is what was actually tested, is actually completely far off the truth. Now, of course, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt because this is on the overdrive set to off. So what about on the weak mode? Here you can see the average initial time goes to 3.23 milliseconds, but the percent in window is still very low at 30%. The same could be said on its medium overdrive, with the average initial time dropping down to 2.74 milliseconds, with the percent in window still setting at only 37%. Now, if you look at the middle of your screen, you'll be able to see the RGB overshoot. And yes, there is pretty much none of it on the medium overdrive. But that completely changes on its strong mode overdrive. There's a lot more error. In other words, you can see a lot more inverse ghosting, which will distract you when you're gaming. However, on the flip side, you can see now that the average initial time sits at a stonkingly low 1.23 milliseconds, while the percent in window sits at a very impressive 80%, at least for an LCD monitor. Indeed, over here, it is a little bit of a catch-22. You're getting really good response times, but you're getting a pretty poor visual experience. What I can say subjectively is while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, which isn't exactly the most graphically intense game out there, no matter what Valve has done over the years, it is still actually noticeable when you're going to be panning around scenes, you'll be able to see some inverse ghosting. As such, over here, you might want to dial it down to its medium overdrive setting. However, do bear in mind that the overall percent in window is pretty poor, and the average initial time, in other words, the responsiveness of the panel, is not comparable to what you should be expecting for a 500Hz panel. What I'm effectively trying to convey over here is that this AOC monitor does actually do a pretty poor job of giving you that fluid gaming experience, because you're either getting a lot of inverse ghosting or you are getting a slower response time of the monitor, which therefore doesn't really suit for a high refresh rate monitor. As a result over here, if you do look at some of its competitors, be it some OLEDs out there, or indeed the other 540Hz ETN panel that I reviewed by Asus, this monitor did a far better job across the board by not only providing you stonkingly good response times, but also a better visual experience on the higher overdrive mode settings. Now with that said, the monitor has got a good sort of motion clarity, despite the fact you are getting a lot of inverse ghosting on its highest overdrive mode. Especially over here if you were to enable MBR, in other words motion blur reduction. You can actually adjust it by the different level increments, and there's 20 for you to choose from via the monitor's OSD, and the monitor still stays pretty bright, which is very much appreciated, so therefore it will be actually very usable in a bright sunlit room, even if you were to enable MBR, which isn't the same that could be said about the vast majority of alternatives out there on the market. Now I should mention over here that MBR can actually be used simultaneously with the likes of NVIDIA G-Sync or AMD FreeSync, and this is because the monitor has got an MBR sync option that can be selected via the monitor's OSD. It's effectively an on and off toggle, and in my case I was able to run it at 500Hz at Full HD. Moving swiftly on, let's talk about adaptive sync technologies, and by that I mean NVIDIA G-Sync and AMD FreeSync. And the monitor has not got a native G-Sync module, and as such the VRR range sits from 48 up to 540Hz, of course if you're connected over DisplayPort. This will sit to 48 to 240Hz if you're running HDMI for any given reason. Now in my case I've got an RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort I was able to run NVIDIA G-Sync. Oddly it didn't really run on the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, however I was able to fire up a game such as Destiny 2 and run NVIDIA G-Sync without encountering any sort of black screen issues or flickering. Of course your mileage may vary depending on your own PC configuration. Furthermore, I was also able to run 500Hz at Full HD with NVIDIA G-Sync and also HDR all simultaneously enabled, and therefore means that it gave me a little bit of a better experience when I was playing more casual games. Now it is worth pointing out over here that the monitor has got a Display HDR 400 certification, which isn't anything really to shout about because the overall HDR reproduction is somewhat subdued, but is going to be appreciated by certain gamers out there which have got the ability of running an HDR signal. Then this is something that you might want to do on this monitor, but again it's not something of a selling point, at least not in my opinion. So past the overall gaming performance, let's talk about the image quality of this monitor. As a reminder, you've got a 24.1 inch flat TN panel with a matte coating to it. And yes, the overall viewing angles of a TN panel are not very comparable to a VA, IPS, or let alone an OLED. So therefore some food for thought if you're going to be using it for media consumption and you're looking at it at a slight different angle. Now via the monitor's OSD you have got a dedicated sRGB mode which has also got full brightness controls. Now in said mode I had its gamut coverage tested at 86% and its gamut volume at 89.8%. You can see below how it compares to the standard. The average delta-E sits at a disappointingly high 2.5 with a maximum delta-E of 5.06. Therefore I wouldn't use this for any serious image editing work or video grading. Its tested contrast ratio was actually relatively good for a TN panel at 1242 to 1, while the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 6037 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard, but is a little bit off. Now if you do want the image to pop a little bit more, you might want to go on the native panel preset, and in here with the warm mode set, I had the gamut coverage and gamut volumes positively affected in the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 color spaces. Concentrating on the latter, it hit 88.7% and 94.9% in the coverage and volume respectively. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. Yet again, the overall color accuracy in the DCI-P3 color space is not good, with an average delta of 3.36 and a maximum of 6.08. Tested contrast ratio does not shift, however the measured white point does slightly move to 6093 Kelvin at 100%. Now with the gamma set at level 3 via the monitor's OSD versus the level 1 which I previously used for the sRGB mode, you can see over here that the gamma tries to shift a little bit closer to the 2.6 standard, however it is still a little bit of a way off. Now, in terms of the overall brightness of the monitor, in HDR I clocked in 389 nits, which is a little bit off the display HDR 400 certification that one might expect. Nonetheless, in SDR it does actually get pretty bright at 383 nits and therefore can be definitely used in a bright sunlit room. The same could be said that if you were to enable the boost mode or turn up the MBR all the way to level 20, it will still get pretty bright at 302 nits, although here it's worth noting it will be locked at the different levels, in terms of the overall brightness that is. As for the minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 73 nits, which shows good sort of range. Now, as for the overall brightness uniformity of this panel, it is a little bit disappointing. As you can see on my tested monitor, it didn't perform too well across the board. Given the small form factor and a TN panel, you might have expected better results, but alas, that's not the case. As for the overall backlight bleed, well, it is minimal considering it is a TN panel and therefore is going to be far more favorable in comparison to the likes of an IPS alternative. Moving swiftly on, I would like to talk about the overall build quality of this monitor. And here you've got a three-sided ballast design with a small bottom bezel. It's also worth mentioning over here that a small power LED at the bottom right-hand side of the screen cannot be fully disabled, but is actually quite faint. Now, as for the monitor stand itself, it is actually very sturdy. It provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments and therefore giving you good sort of ergonomics. It can also be replaced via VESA compatible stand if you so wish. And you might indeed want to do that because it has got a very asymmetrical design, which really does my head in when it comes to my little bit of OCD that I have. Nonetheless, over here, AOC claim that it's done for those eSports gamers out there who just want to shove their faces into the monitor and have a really odd keyboard or mouse setup. You might have seen it in the Pro scene, for example. Certainly not recommended for your health, so just bear that in mind. Now, aside from this, you might have noticed that at the back of the monitor there's some RGB lights, and yes, you can customize them to pretty much your heart's content. However, I don't really see the point of them, given that they're not bright enough to be shining on a wall, and given that you're not actually going to be seeing the back of the monitor, you might want to fully disable them because it's going to increase your energy consumption. Now, on that note, if you do want to customize it or indeed fully disable it, which I would highly recommend, then here you can access it via the monitor's OSD. There's a small little joystick button that's found at the bottom right-hand side of the monitor. And here you'll find a comprehensive suite of options and a very nice layout that's been done by the manufacturer, and therefore makes it very easy and quite intuitive to enable or disable certain settings, or of course play around with the overdrive modes like I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Now, to conclude, I would just like to mention that there are 4 USB Type-A ports, 2 of which are mounted on the left-hand side and 2 that are found towards the bottom of the monitor. These also reside next to a 3.5mm jack, which can be handy for plugging in your headphones directly into the monitor. And the reason I highlight this is because the monitor does not have any built-in speakers, which doesn't really bother me in the slightest, but just something I thought I should mention in my review. So to summarize, my experiences of the AOC Agon Pro AG246FK have been actually pretty disappointing. See, at its maximum overdrive setting, you're getting quite a lot of inverse ghosting, all while getting very good response times. But if you were to go on its medium overdrive, then here you're getting pretty poor response time for what you should expect at a 500Hz refresh rate. As a result, I'll just suggest looking elsewhere, be it at its main competitor from Asus, which runs a 540Hz ETN panel with Full HD and costs a little bit more, or indeed just looking at an IPS, VA, or an OLED monitor, be it Full HD or indeed 1440p. Some of which I would actually recommend will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of this AOC monitor down in the comment section below. And of course, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.